Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's been a while. I've been on the road for the Power BI World Tours. I've gone out and visited a couple different cities, and then I finished off that tour with a visit to Florida, where I went to go see VS Live, Office Live, SharePoint Live, and I was presenting in SQL Live. And I met a brand new friend, a new MVP who I hadn't met before, doing a really cool topic. A lot of people on this call know that I'm kind of excited about geeky security, Active Directory stuff, because that's required for doing development on the Power BI platform. And I saw one of the presentations in the SharePoint live session was how to go out and automate the B2B process using Flow. Now, in most cases, or in many cases, people will go into SharePoint and they'll go out and add their foreign principal, and it just works. At Microsoft, that's what happens. And I can go out into Power BI and I can go into my apps and I can invite somebody, and it does all this right stuff in the background to go out and invite those people in their Active Directory. A lot of companies, as Paul knows and was asked to come out and help out, they've turned that facility off. You cannot go out and just willy-nilly add a bunch of foreign principals in their Active Directory. I know it's shocking that they would actually close something like that down. Actually, I'm being facetious. It probably makes sense that more people don't do that. But they did want to go out and enable their information workers to kind of that new digital age where they could bring in that information. They could go out and share that data. But they did want to have some oversight. And this is what Paul was working on. So am I doing a pretty good job of describing that, Paul?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, what we're going to ask you to do is go ahead and start sharing your desktop, because we learned a little while ago that if you do it before I kicked off the presentation, we lose everything. So we're going to go out and see if Paul can share his desktop. And I think he's actually looking at me, looking at him, talking. So we're going to actually have him bring up something like his PowerPoint slides are perfect. And at this point, if you have any questions, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A. I see that Shamatix has got something. Hardeeb says, whoop, whoop. And I'm going to actually monitor that Q&A panel, and I'm going to let Paul walk through this presentation. He has a ton of content, and it's pretty technical. So yes, not only is this being recorded, you can even actually rewind it while he's talking and go back and review something in real time, which is kind of weird and scary. But Paul, I hand the microphone over to you, my friend.
All right. Thank you very much. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to do a subset of this talk that I called Feel the Flow, just because who doesn't love alliteration. But so some of the slides may be beginning level, but we'll work through it. Again, my name is Paul Schaeflein, a Microsoft MVP in the office development space. There's contact information there, and obviously you'll see that plenty as we go through here. But I just start out by pointing out what is Flow. I went and get the marketing mumbo jumbo off of the internets and show it to people and then just move on. But to summarize, it's a way to provide some automated workflows across services. And so that's what we're going to be doing here, is crossing the different services and solving a business problem. I like to point out, right, this is typically a developer audience, so developers want to break things down so we understand the various pieces of what's going on. So just at high level, in order to use Flow, you have a trigger. Something happens somewhere that is going to start the process, so some trigger of some form. That trigger is then going to be in response to that trigger, we will run an action, and an action is based on a service. And we see this a lot in the Flow Designer, where there's dozens and dozens of services and hundreds of actions. And that's the key thing that we want to make sure we understand. Flow, of course, can do conditional processing. It can do looping constructs, as we'd expect in order to solve any business problem. And another thing to keep in mind is that Flow automatically will hold inputs and outputs and maintain state for us, so we don't really have to think about that. If I'm a developer, a service-oriented architecture that is stateless is very helpful, because that state is handled for me. I don't have to make my code complicated. And that's, again, what we're trying to do here, is just do a simple little task to help enable people to share content externally in a secure fashion. So it's not just the flows themselves that we have to worry about. There is this whole ecosystem of things that are available in Flow. First, we talk about owners and my flows and team flows. Again, we're not doing entry-level stuff today, so we'll zoom by that. Environments become kind of important, however, because I can create multiple environments in Flow, and each environment can have separate set of connectors. And that's another thing that we want to zoom into here is we have connections that we can make from the Flow service to other services, and environments let us restrict who can access different connections and or connect to our on-premises through the gateway. And part of what we'll talk about today is how we can use this connection model and put some custom business logic somewhere out on the internet, build a connector, integrate that with Flow, make sure it's available to people using environments as necessary. So it's a pretty flexible model that lets me be helpful to people, but not be out in the wild, wild west. One approach would, of course, could be when people are thinking about the security as maybe the gateway is going to help me. But you see here, the gateway really talks about data. And so I didn't consider the gateway to solve this problem at all, because what I really want to do is not necessarily on-premises stuff. Although my directory starts on-premises, it's replicated to the cloud, and I'm managing external sharing, which is not necessarily my group. So again, this is gateway, while it sounds promising, and when we talk about this, it really is not going to meet the problem or solve the problem that I have. So I quickly came to the conclusion I need to do a connector using a custom API. And this process really is straightforward, but just to reinforce some of the issues, your custom API must be internet accessible, right? Microsoft Flow is in the cloud, so it's going to make a call. It must be accessible. Now, you don't necessarily have to host it in the cloud, but you do need some type of domain routing or holes in your firewall to get through to the service, right? What I chose to do was use Azure Web Services, or Azure App Service, I'm sorry. Obviously, that works pretty well. When I have my service, I write a web service. I chose a web API service, and each method in my service is then mapped to, or can be mapped to, an action in Flow. So if you remember the parts of a flow, what we have are actions. And in my specific scenario, my action is I want to add a user to the directory, and I'll talk more about that scenario in just a bit. Any method parameters that I define in my API then can be mapped to action input, and any output that I return from my method will be stored in the state inside Flow. Again, I can do stateless functions or stateless methods, and the Flow service will manage all that for me. So how do I create a custom API? Again, depending on your level of proficiency, it's either hard or difficult. I like to say it's just 3 simple steps. You write some code, you describe that service, and you deploy. The important thing here is that deployment is your responsibility. Even though Flow is going to be calling your method and managing state for you, and it has all kinds of capabilities, at the end of the day, it's calling your service. So deploying and managing that deployment is your responsibility. So you still have to make your hand involved here, get your networking team involved as well, right? And now I want to dig a little deeper into what writing the code really means. It's internet accessible service. You can use web API, Node, whatever technology or language meets your developer's skill set. It can be done. But the hardest part, of course, is the security, and that's where we'll dig a little bit deeper here as we go on. But think about this. We're deploying a web service on the internet, and so who can call that service? Do you want everybody in the world who can just make an HTTP request call your service? My scenario is add guest users to my Active Directory. I certainly don't want anybody in the world doing that for me. So I need to make sure my service is secure, and in addition, I need to understand what resources will my service call. Again, my scenario is I'm writing a web service, and my web service wants to write to my Azure Active Directory. And so am I going to use a trust identity subsystem? Am I going to pass through the identity of the caller back into my to access that resource? You need to think through these scenarios and understand what's high risk, what's allowed, what's a non-starter. So it's really a complicated scenario, and then that's the focus of what we'll get onto here when we start getting into the demo. After we decide and resolve all those issues, we describe our service using something called the OpenAPI which was formerly known as Swagger. You can also exercise your web service interactively using the Postman client and export the collection and upload that into Flow as well. Either one of those choices would work. And lastly, deploy. We're going to assume that people are listening and know how to deploy a .NET project into various different hosting resources, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. And so that gets us through the messy PowerPoint stuff. No one likes that. Let's get into some code. So next I'm going to switch over to the browser real quick, and just to point out on my blog at www.shaeflein.net, I've described a lot of this, and it covers into the process of what's happening here. And this gets into this scenario. A scenario here is a customer had SharePoint. They wanted to do external sharing. They didn't want users just clicking the anonymous link and send stuff all over the place, right? So this blog series talks through how this was accomplished. And let me just walk through some of the settings that we did to make that happen. The first thing we did is we went into the Office 365 Administration Center, and under Services and Add-ins, we can go into Microsoft Groups, which is here, and I turned off the setting here to let people can share, but they cannot add new users to the group. We don't want everybody in the world just adding new users like crazy. So I'm saying we'll allow some sharing inside of groups, but we don't want people to go nuts, right? And then in SharePoint, which is where some of the files are actually stored, we configured this to say that we don't mind sharing with external users, but we need to know who those external users are. We're not going to just let anybody get a link using anonymous. And to further confuse issue, the SharePoint Administration Center has its own sharing settings. So if I click in the SharePoint Administration Center under sharing, this is the key setting here that this is what the security folks were happy with. If you have, I'm sorry, this one here, the allow sharing with external users that already exist in an organization's directory. And so this is going to ensure that anonymous links will not work. It'll ensure that we know at some level who the people are who are accessing content. They have a record in our directory, so all of our audit controls and all the functionality that SharePoint and Office 365 bring in that area, we can at least identify who's accessing data. This was what met the security requirements of the customer. And that all sounds great unless you're the poor chap who has to add users to the directory. So now what do I do? And this is where Flow and its custom connector could solve this problem. So the solution was a simple web API. So here in Visual Studio, a web API project, and a single controller for the external user's controller. This is a pretty straightforward code, right? We're going to simply make sure that our call is authorized, and we'll talk a little bit about that further. But I want to make sure that anonymous is not going to be allowed. So we attribute that. We defined an input object, an external user invite, and what I want to get from users is a display name and email address and the ability to specify this redirect URL. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. Okay. So that's our input, and when we get that value, then we're just going to just simply convert that to a JSON object and make a call out to the Microsoft Graph. So if I dig deeper into some of these methods here, this has been extracted out. But at some point, we're going to go through and get an app-only token, which is, again, a helper method that I wrote. And after I get the token, I can just make a post to the endpoint, which is graph.microsoft.com /organization. I'm sorry, well, so /beta/invitations. And actually, the production code I have running is hitting the production endpoint. But as part of the Microsoft Graph, there is this invitations API that lets me programmatically invoke the Azure B2B external user invitation process. And so that is, again, a somewhat risky operation. We want to make sure that we're making calls appropriately. I've suppressed anonymous users, so I'm letting people who come in with the correct credentials call my method. And then in my token helper code that we showed here, I am actually getting a token. So I can show that code real quick. First of all, to see how this authorization works, that's in the auth configuration under app start. And this is configured to that we're going to want to use Windows Azure Active Directory bearer authentication option. So the middleware is configured to require a bearer token from an Azure Active Directory, and my audience is my domain with a specific GUID, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And so the idea, of course, here is that I need the token issued from some tenant. My tenant's in app settings in Azure, and we're going to make sure that I get a token from that tenant. If I get a token from that tenant, which means the person requesting the token has an account in that tenant, I'm going to let the call go through. In the web API, again, we're making a call to this post method. So we'll drill in through these helper methods. And so when I'm getting the app only token here, this method is making a call to login.microsoftonline.com with a specific tenant, again, my tenant ID. And we're using the ADEL libraries for .NET to establish a context. And inside that context, we're asking for a token. The resource I'm going to be requesting for is Microsoft Graph. And then I create what we call a client credential, which is an ID and a key for this application. It's a service principal for this application. And in order for that to work, it requires setup inside of Azure Active Directory. So we'll go to Azure Active Directory and walk through that. And this is where we can start getting kind of complicated. So we'll slow down for just a little bit here. Inside of Azure and my Azure Active Directory, we click on app registrations. And then I actually went through and clicked new application registration. So at the moment, I've already registered this, so we'll just click through this one and you can take a look. I have an application that's registered. It is assigned an ID by Azure Active Directory, so I store that information. Inside the portal here, you see there's a setting for keys, and I can generate a new key, which is going to be some cryptographic string that is then known. This key we can consider the password. So for this particular object in the directory, this object is an application. It has an ID and it has a secret or a password. And in Visual Studio, I can come into web config, put that information in my web.config, use that as part of the code, and then when I create a client credential, in effect, I have a user ID and a password that represents this application inside my directory. This application requested some permission. So in this particular application, there's one app permission requested for the Microsoft Graph. Inside of this portal here, there are two types of permissions. There's application permissions, and if I scroll further down, I'll have delegated permissions. I went too far, sorry there. Delegated permissions. And the concept here is a delegated permission means the application wants to do something with the current user information. Maybe I want to read the current user's profile or send mail as the current user. In my scenario, we don't want every member of the organization to update Active Directory. We want to do that on their behalf. The whole point of this process, of course, is to let users request a new user and have the application created for them. So this particular application is configured with application permissions, also known as app-only permission, and it's requesting to read and write directory data. After that is saved, as a tenant administrator, I clicked on the Grant Permission button, which says I understand that anyone who has this app ID and this secret, if they have those two values, they will be able to write information into my directory. And because that's a somewhat privileged operation, it requires tenant administration consent, also called admin consent. Now, there is a lot of documentation around how to provide admin consent, and you can wrap that up with inside your code if you wish. But my scenario is not a service that I'm hosting for multiple tenants. It's really a standalone. This particular tenant wants to do that. So the grant permission button will provide that administrative consent for this application in this directory. This is a single tenant app. So after all that process, what we have now is we have a web API method, this external users controller method, when I make a post, that provided I get valid information, it can then make a call to Microsoft Graph and create a guest user. So that's the first step. I now have my my web API. you remember back in the slide deck, once we have this, the next thing is to describe this. And so to describe this, I need an OpenAPI document. You can manually create those or generate them. And so what I chose to do is use a NuGet package to generate this. So the names get kind of crazy here, but back in the day, this document was called a Swagger document. And the Swagger document can be created using a NuGet package called Swashbuckle. So I end up with a Swashbuckle package from NuGet that generates this Swagger config class. The Swagger config class is part of the app start. It's wired up during app start, and its sole purpose in life is to reflect upon the assemblies in this project and generate this document on my behalf. So I left this as is. You can see all these comments come with when you install this NuGet package into your project, and it walks you through the various steps about what you need to do, right? I'm defining HTTPS only because that's what you do now. I give it a name. Further down, you'll see I'm coding and saying my application is requiring OAuth 2.0. I want, when you are making a call into my service, you have to have a Windows Azure Active Directory bearer token. And in order to get that, you have to follow the OAuth 2 protocol using an access code approach. Lots of documents in the world about how OAuth 2 works. I'm just stating that if you're going to call my service, you have to do that. The rest of the file, there's a lot of stuff commented out that aren't necessarily needed. We'll get back to this operation filter just a minute, but further down you see there's the ability to enable the Swagger UI if you wish to do that. So I'm going to show you that real quick here, but there are just a couple settings we're setting up in here. The idea here is that I can use the Swagger UI, the Swashbuckle Swagger UI page, in order to request it, and that's what this URL host is here. So I'm going to real quick just start the project and let that run. And I've configured my project to use this Swagger UI document as the home page. I'm doing HTTPS on my local host, and even though it says it's not recommended, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Go ahead and proceed. And it's waiting. Oh, make sure I don't have debugging set on. Yep, okay, it's running. And so I get a user interface that will then let me visualize the way this API document is described. External users is my controller. It has a post method, and so I can see there's a URL /API/external users. And by clicking through this, I can see that the expected response is a 200, and it'll return information about the invited user. Further down are the input parameters, and over here on the right-hand side, it's expecting for me to send in those three values as an object. So this user interface lets me visualize and see this. Now, if you wanted to go through, you could try it out. I'm going to click try it out, and it says, oh, you have to give me information. Let me just set that in real quick. Now, if I click try it out, real quick, you'll see I'm getting a 401 authorization has been denied. I don't have a Windows Azure Active Directory bearer token, so I can't make this call. That's a good thing. There is an option up here to click this and try to log in, but if you remember, I've configured this at the moment to use localhost, and that's really not what I want to do. So this authorize button won't work for me because I didn't configure that up. But the goal here is to show you I can end up with this document. And this document is available at this URL. I'm going to copy that, and we'll just paste that URL into the browser. Now you'll see that this is the JSON object that represents that. Now, I presume you want to see a little bit prettier, so I've opened that in Visual Studio Code, and you can see this is the format of a OpenAPI version 2.0 document. Describes my service, provides a host name, which I would change for production. I have one path. This external user is the path. It requires a post method. And here we can specify your HTTP stuff that you'd expect. And here's my parameters. I'm expecting an object named invitation in the body, and it has a schema. And if I come back up to my definitions, I'm sorry, scrolling fast there, but under definitions, here's my external user invite. it requires all three pieces of information, and all three pieces of information are defined as strings. I think if you've done any work back in the day using WSDL, this similar information. But furthermore, what you'll see here is that this particular operation, this post operation, collapse these on a little bit so you can see, close the produces, my external user's post method has a security setting called AAD. And that's just a string that I made up, definition of AAD, in which I say I need OAuth 2 use the access code flow, and in order to get the token, you need to hit this authorization URL. This value here is my tenant ID. So you need to, any code that wants to call my web API has to get a token from this authorization URL. Now, in Flow, I can go through and upload this API and describe it. But there's one thing I want to talk about first. Who is going to be calling my API, right? And so in our scenario, I want Flow to call my API. But Flow is not controlled by Paul, right? This is my tenant, the directory's in my tenant. I'm controlling what's happening here. And so I don't want to just let the Flow application call directly into my web API. I want to create a proxy application to help facilitate that. Thinking about this, right? If for some reason someone gets access to Flow, right? Some users added, or I think there may be a bad actor somewhere in the world. I want the ability to control and protect my application. So what I'm going to do is inside of my Azure Active Directory, I created a second application. So if I go into app registrations, you'll see here, this is my B2B invite custom API. This is yet another app registration, another security principle in my directory. It has an application ID. It also has a secret, which I could never remember every time, so I'd create a new one each time. But the idea, of course, is that there is a secret for this security principle. Now, the permissions for this security principle are, I want this thing to be able to call my web API. So I have this intermediate step. I'm going to tell Microsoft Flow, hey, when you connect, I want you to use the app ID and app secret of this custom API object, and that will allow it to get a token, and that token will have the ability to call into my API. So keep that in mind. We have two Azure Active Directory application registrations, and that's simply a choice that I made so that if for any reason I need to worry about something happening, I can come in and start removing these passwords, removing these keys, and that would break the flow. So I can protect my directory from bad things happening. It's just a level of flexibility. So now I think I'm done. I've written my code. I've secured my code using my Windows Azure Active Directory. I created a proxy application, and now I need to get this information over to Flow to do that. So I'm switched over to Microsoft Flow. Now, obviously, I have one of these already set up, so we'll just talk through the steps, but we won't always hit save. And I'm going to go into the custom connectors. There's a plus sign to create a new one, and I will import an OpenAPI file. Right? And I have it saved locally. So in my dev repos folder, so let me go back here, go to, oh, sorry, wrong button. Stop, dev repos, B2B invite, and here is my file, and I click on that, and I need to give this title. Continue. Now, Flow will then read this file and set me through a wizard that let me describe my connector. I can upload an icon, I can give it a color, fill in some information. It shows the reflect here. It says HTTPS host. Well, that's not the host I want. Mine is going to be B2B invite Azure websites.net. So you can see there, even though my document points to my development instance, I can configure that as I see fit. And now when I click continue, moving on in the wizard is my security. If you remember, I said that you have to get a token using OAuth 2.0. Flow figures that out. My OAuth 2 provider is Azure Active Directory. And here I need a client ID and a client secret. That would be the values from my proxy application. So just to show how this will work, I'm going to go through and create a new one here. And inside the Azure portal, when I click save, it will then generate that key for me. And it tells me you better save this because you'll never ever see it again, which is fine. I'm going to copy that. Notepad real quick. And I also need to know the application ID, so I'm going to copy that. Now I can return to Flow and fill in those. Oh, I just hit the wrong button. Doggone it. So let's try that again. So custom connector. Oh, actually, this will be, I'm just going to edit the one that's here now for the interest of time. And so in this wizard under the security settings, I would fill in the client ID and client secret that I just copied along with, right? All the information I can leave as is. What's interesting is this resource URL. And so this can be a little bit confusing, but if we think this through, it makes sense. This application is logging in as the proxy application.
Hey, Paul,
and
can I interrupt? I think Mary had a question about something you just covered.
Certainly. Sure.
Mary was asking, what's the value of the proxy application? Why do you even need a proxy application in this case?
I don't need it technically. I'm choosing to do that because I'm providing an application ID and an application secret to an application that's not mine. I'm providing it to Microsoft Flow. It's just a security principle that Paul believes requires me to separate that. The primary application, if you have the app ID and the app secret for my primary application, you can write to my directory. And if I want to change that password, that means it breaks my code. Because I have this proxy application, if for some reason I want to, I'm worried about users, abusing my system, or let's say that you have a web service that's called by Microsoft Flow, but it's also called by some other backend system or some other, maybe you have a web application that users are using. You would want to have a separate proxy application for each of those remote services so that you can permission them and control them directly. That's just the security principle that makes me feel better. But technically, it's not required. But it certainly is a best practice from Paul's point of view.
Okay, makes perfect sense. Mary, I hope that explained it for you as well.
So in Flow, I'm providing a secret, and I'm saying the resource that my application wants, this resource URL is the GUID for my web API, because Flow is calling my web API, so the resource that it needs is my web API. And then this thing at the bottom is a redirect URL, and this is a special URL. If you notice, it's the Azure API Management Service. This is what Microsoft Flow requires in order to manage the tokens, because what's going to happen is a user will then create a connection using my connector, and the token management is all handled by Flow. And so this is documented in the Flow documentation until you put in this redirect URL, which is what Flow is going to use to manage the tokens. So that's my security settings. If I go into the definition tab of the wizard shows my web API methods, right? And so the summary is not called up here, so we just type in information. But you'll see if I look down here, this is my external user API. If I look further down, you'll see it requires a post request to that relative URL. And further down, you'll see that it has a definition of the body, which is my invitation. And if I look in here, I'm going to see the three properties that I would expect, and each of these are marked as a string. And so this is really just a visual representation of that OpenAPI document. And once I follow through and click save, which I'm going to close now without saving, but I end up then with my custom connector. And the custom connector then allows me to make a connection, which is somewhat different. So if I come back into the gear and I look, I can have various connections. And this is where you would see a lot of these. If you use Flow any length of time, we'll have connections to Outlook and SharePoint and all the services that you may use within Office 365. As you see, quite a few of them. I'm going to just click a new connection, and I can then say I want a connection to a various connectors, and mine is called B2B. I can search for that, and there it is. And I can click the plus here. It says I want to create a connection to this custom thing. And when I click create, now it's invoking that OAuth process, and it's saying, okay, you want to make a connection, but who are you? Remember, I am authorizing only people from my Azure Active Directory tenant who are allowed to connect to this. And so part of this registration, this token acquisition, I need to have somebody in my tenant that can call this. Now, remember, I'm using an app-only token from my web service to Azure Active Directory. So I don't have to be an administrator in order to make this connection right now, because my web API in the startup.auth method, I just said, you need a token for this application. I didn't require any specific role for the user of that token. So any one of my users, or all of my users, all of the people who have accounts in my directory, can make the connection to my service, even though they aren't domain admins or tenant admins. That process just works. I now have another connection. So I'm going to delete this one so that I don't have a confusion, right, going forward. But that's how I make a connection using my connector. Now that I've done that, I'm ready to automate my process. And so what's the way to process this? Well, I've been in the SharePoint space forever, so I create a SharePoint list. And so I have a SharePoint list where I ask for the name and the email address, and I've connected a flow to that SharePoint list. So I'm going to go back over to my flows, and you'll see I have one already configured here that is going to be invite a user to the external directory, and we'll click edit on that. And now, what is the business process? Well, a new item is created, add an external user. Well, you know what? Maybe your organization says, I want a manager's approval. And so I can do approvals. Flow is very good at various approvals. I can have the approvals built into Flow. I can do emails, whatever is appropriate. So who's going to do the approval? You know what? I should probably have the end user's manager do that. So maybe what I need to do is add an action to get a manager. So that's also manager. There's also an action for Azure Active Directory to say get manager, up 2 versions. I don't know what the difference is on these, but we'll pick one just for grins. And so the user from which I want to get the manager is the created by email, who created the SharePoint item. And the field that I want, well, I just want to get the manager. I'm going to leave that blank, right? And so now when I do the approval, add an action, do approve, the manager would be doing the approvals. Okay. So approvals, start an approval. Anyone from the list. Oh, and that list would be assigned to, I should be able to say, this is the get the manager. I want this to be the manager's email address, right? So again, this is really nothing unique. I'm not seeing email for some reason. Well, I think you understand the process here, right? I want to then do an approval. At the moment, I'm going to just remove the approvals because this is demo code and I'm allowed to take shortcuts. But I think the point here, of course, is that anything that I can do in Flow is now available to me. When a new item is created, we create the new user. So let me just close out of this. And if I didn't break anything, when I add a new user in here, we should have it work. So I have a second demo tenant here that has a user called Garth. Oops, that's not his name. This is Garth. And I click save. This is my standard SharePoint user interface, no difference. End user goes in and fills out the form. I wish that Garth would have that. Now, I'm going to switch over to Flow, and I go into this Flow, and it's currently running. Again, this is built-in Flow, a new item's created. It's trying to make a call out to my external user service, which hasn't run in weeks, so I'm probably going to have a little delay as part of my application startup process in Azure. But assuming all works well, I end up with a new entry in my directory. So while we're waiting, I'm going to switch back to my tenant. And if I go into the user list, there is a built-in view that the portal provides for us, which will let me just see external users. And so I drop that down to guest users only. Hey, there's Garth F. Garth F was added. Go back to Flow. There's the green check mark that worked. And I seem to have closed it. But if I were to look, Garth would then get an email. As part of the invitation process, Garth would have gotten an email that says, click here to validate who you are. But as you can simply see, I sent information in. I got output bed. If I look at the outputs, remember I returned an information object just in a body. I didn't describe it in Swagger, but at that email, the redirect URL would be something here like my website. Here's a URL that Garth has to do to redeem the information. Now, you can handle this information yourself if you want, or just let the built-in process happen. The point being, of course, because I returned an object in my web API method, that gets returned back to Flow and is stored as part of this. And so I now have Garth.
Can I interrupt you again? Mary has another great question, and
Absolutely.
I don't know the answer to it. She's asked, should you have added a check in your Flow to see if someone actually already requested access? What happens in B2B if you actually go out and try to invite the exact same person that's already there? So nothing to do with the Flow and checking if it's already in the SharePoint list. All the way in the back end, what happens if you try to add duplicate entries?
I have never tried that. So yes, the production code does in fact do validation, yes. So okay. And whether that's done inside the Flow or whether that's done inside your backend service is a detail. I chose to do it in the backend service. But I would expect it'd be just fine because it's,
I think so, because if you look in Active Directory, I am almost positive it will show an invitation is pending and it won't resend it. But in Active Directory, it shows you your invitations and whether or not they're pending.
Yeah, so I would agree. And
okay.
The last thing I wanted to just close out on is, let's say I was in SharePoint and I wanted to share something here. Now that I've configured this and I can put in here, I should be able to find Garth. Well, I haven't accepted it, right? So Garth at, yeah. So because Garth is pending, he won't show, but I can work on that. If there's any other questions, we can take them while I launch another browser window here, and we'll take a look at Garth. Oh no, I need a private one. Incognito. Tapping with my mouse here. I'm going to log in as Garth, and we should see an invite from him. And so Garth has been invited. We click on Garth, and again, the B2B service lets you customize this if you wish. I didn't do that. I just said go ahead and send it, and now we'll process this. And as Chuck mentioned, it was pending. Azure Active Directory is checking to see who is Garth. I've already logged in the Garth's tenant. And now it's saying, by the way, you're accessing stuff in it, as Garth into a different tenant. I can click next, and this completes the process. And then I get redirected to that landing page, right? So hold on while I do this. And remember, I said we can have a redirect page, and so I just redirected them right back to my blog. But you obviously could redirect them to some legal page or whatever mumbo jumbo someone makes you do. I'm going to come back, and in theory, if we refresh the list of users, I don't really see anything different here. If I click on Garth, he looks just like a user in my my tenant, right? It's got a name, it's got an ID. I can see the logins. I can assign him directory roles, whatever. Garth is an object in my tenant. And I'll try this sharing one more time. And if all works well, we should be set. And so there's a cache. So this is really a problem, not a problem. There's a feature of SharePoint in which they cache Active Directory names, and it hasn't come through just yet, but it would work. So that's
wouldn't you expect to see this as that ext, that pound ext pound, and their external tenant name in SharePoint when it works?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your question. Sorry.
When you go out and reference these foreign principals, you would expect to see them as a pound ext, their foreign tenant name pound, and then your directory, whatever your directory is named. Is that how SharePoint works, or is that just how VSTS and Power BI work? I can actually see foreign principals. They look differently. They're UPN. Actually.
Yeah. No, the SharePoint is going to try to show the display name here. If I look at the profile for Garth, when again, it's this value here, this name. And so now obviously I could have built the my save button's not working. But again, as part of the invitation, I could, or when I remember I did an invitation, I just provided simple information so that could be updated. And once they're added, they are actually, maybe that redirect screen, instead of being my blog, should be a profile page, and ask them to fill out the form and complete that. So lots of different choices there.
And this is actually not the norm. This is an exception workflow where people have locked down their Active Directory. And I'm guessing that that's probably going to happen more and more as the world progresses. But you wouldn't have to do this. But the whole workflow that Paul just went through is going to be much more important for people like Teams, who are announcing that they're going to support external people. I'm not on the Teams team, but I'll be willing to bet you $20 I know how they're going to implement it. It's going to look a lot like what Paul just went through. We talked about how PowerApps is going to implement foreign users in a PowerApp. I am related to the PowerApps team, and I can tell you that this is how they are going to implement this, just like Power BI did a couple weeks ago. So again, most cases you won't have to go through this, but it is going to be something that is going to crop up. I don't know. What would you guess that people lock down their Active Directory where people can't add? Is that a 10%, do you think, Paul?
Well, I would recharacterize it and say that they didn't lock it down as much as they put a gate in front of it.
Okay.
And I would expect that to be the majority of medium and large enterprises. Maybe small businesses won't. They don't have those controls in place. But once an organization starts to mature and understand that information needs to be controlled or at least monitored, I think it would be increasing more and more.
So like a 70% of the people may run into something like this.
Yeah. But every organization of a decent size that I've consulted with has had controls around external sharing for sure. It's very, very popular with the larger organizations.
Okay. So Mary goes out, and Mary, thanks for actually staying in context. We had a lot of questions while you were doing this. People asking how to do PowerPoint, how to schedule refreshes, but Mary stayed true to the task, and she says, Paul, how do you manage the life cycle of those B2B accounts? I mean, assuming that I approve a B2B account and it is created, obviously I don't want that account to remain in my directory forever. So why don't you talk to her about what are some of the huge benefits of using B2B?
So the account is now listed in my directory. What process do you have to remove users from your directory? In my scenario, whatever I would use to remove employees, I could also use to remove Garth, because Garth shows as an object in the directory. Microsoft Graph lets me query the directory, so I can do a query for all guest users, and in fact, that's the built-in view that I had shown here. It'll show me all of those. So if I want to automate that process, I can certainly do that. Remember, Garth was added using a custom web API. I could certainly have a database connected to that web API in which I'm recording who requested it, when it happened. Maybe my SharePoint list also has some other fields that says how long should access be allowed, and I can store that information and do a manual cleanup. the possibilities are endless, of course, right? Because I now am controlling how that directory, how that person gets added with a specific thing, and maybe some of these processes run on a timer. Maybe you have other flows that do other things. Really, it can be anything that your organization requires. What I'm seeing is that so in the scenario that I think we're going to see a lot of is people have teams and they invite new users to teams. Azure Active Directory and Office 365 is putting some lifecycle around teams, and so a team can be deleted after a certain amount of time. But there's one other thing I want to point out. Just because Garth exists in my directory doesn't mean he can access everything in my SharePoint. He still shows as a guest type, and in my SharePoint sites, my OneDrive libraries, the default so for SharePoint sites, when I create them, I say who's allowed to access this site. And people have not added Garth because Garth never existed until today. So even though he exists in my directory, he won't have access to anything unless I specifically grant it to him. So while it sounds like there's an issue, it really is not an issue. It's just more of a cleanup set. So I hope I made that clear.
And if Garth ever loses employment as SCMVP, his native tenant, where he came from, he doesn't exist there. Therefore, he loses all permissions downstream. Anybody that is gone out and extended him an invitation, he would lose access all the way through because we wouldn't even validate his native directory itself.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So at Microsoft, we actually go out and clean up all of our groups and our teams every 3 months. I am assuming that they actually use the Graph API to go backtrack and validate that the people who were in those are actually still valid as well. But I get notifications probably weekly as a group or a team that I had created or have access to is actually pending being deleted if we don't go out and do something. So Mary, I hope that helped. Paul, I told you that for every minute you were over, I owed you a beer. Definitely no beers being owed today. And then for every 10 minutes you were early, that I owed you a beer. So I'm going to round up. It looks like I have to buy you one at this point. But unless there's any other questions, I'm going to leave it for you to wrap up.
Yeah. So again, let me. I think I covered all the slides here. I had a slide to go through this. Yeah, that was it. We covered all that. Let me just go back and show. I'll put the blog site up again. Again, this whole process was in a blog series that covers a little bit about the scenario, what the administrator had to do, and how a developer can fill in a gap. So www.shaeflein.net, and thanks very much for having me. I hope people found it helpful.
Thank you much, Paul. You take care, and I'll actually answer the rest of the questions in the Q&A window.